morning and welcome to the Child Protection in Sports Unit, Safeguarding LGBT plus young people in sport. My name's Michelle North and you'll be hearing from my colleague Lisa Ware in a bit, and we're joined by Lou from Pride Sport. So thank you for joining us this morning. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Lisa now.
So good morning everybody. Today we're going to go through young people, LGBT young people within sport, and the aims are we're going to begin to look at safeguarding issues for young people in and out of sport. Now I'm sure you can appreciate that we've only got an hour for the webinar, so we'll be signposting you to some further reading, and Lou's going to be talking about a better understanding of the LGBT community and particularly the diversity within that community, because obviously it's a broad spectrum of different young people. We're going to look at practical ways and practical issues in sport and ways to possibly address them, and what some NGBs are doing and how what good practices are going on, and give you some practical next steps within sports clubs. Okay, so first of all, we just wanted a bit of interaction from yourselves and wanted to know what do you think are the particular safeguarding issues for LGBT plus young people within sport. So if you'd like to use your questions box and be able to populate that for us.
So we've got some around changing rooms, bullying. Yeah, that seems to be quite discrimination, understanding of discrimination and mental health, and understanding their own sexuality. Quite a lot of people are talking about preconceptions or discrimination, I think probably is the theme across all of them, and stereotypes. And someone's put in about stigmatization and confidence. That's a really interesting one. I think Lou's going to talk about that a little bit later on. And feeling accepted and stereotypes and the confidence about being answered.
Okay, so thank you very much for that. So I think you've all hit the nail on the head. So young people with LGBT plus are more likely to have higher levels of mental health, self-harm, low self-esteem, suicide attempts, feeling isolated, and homophobic bullying. So what we know from surveys that have been done about young people from the LGBT community is that they're more likely to feel safe if they feel valued and are able to be themselves within any sporting environment that they're participating in. It's important that they feel included and part of the community, and that they have access to resources and information that are relevant to them, and that they feel that that they've got people to talk to and people can identify with them and know how to access support services available to them. So at the bottom there, we've got thinking about your own organisation. Can you answer positively to the above, and have you asked young people that? So that's just something for you to reflect on later when the webinar is finished, about whether you can answer yes to those questions. And if not, then maybe Lou can give you some tips and advice about how to improve that. So why is it important for us to be thinking about LGBT young people within sport? In 2016, Public Health did a survey for over 1,000 young people, and what was discovered is that 55% of men, 56% of women, and 64% of young people who didn't identify as male or female felt that they were not active enough within the general population. And obviously that's a big difference between the average general population. Okay, so now we're going to hand over to Lou. Lou is Director of Pride Sport, and she's joining us from Wales. And she's an author of Sport, Physical Activity for LGBT, and that was compiled for Sport England. So we're really grateful that Lou's able to join us all the way from Wales and do her presentation this morning. So Lou, I'm hoping that you have access to the screen and now are in control of it.
I hope so too. I think I have. If I start scrolling and nothing happens, just give me a shout. Okay, so this morning I'm going to, my presentation is going to be really in three parts. The first part's going to be looking at what the issues are, what are the issues facing LGBT plus young people. And then the subsequent two parts are really going to be about what we can do about that, you know, how we can welcome LGBT plus young people into sport, and how we can encourage people to participate. Just before we start, just to say, Pride Sports is currently using the LGBT plus acronym, and that's because we want to incorporate not only people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender, but also people who identify as queer, as a rejection of those labels, people who identify as asexual, for example, or pansexual as well. So what we're finding is that actually younger people are tending to use the LGB and T less. So we think it's really important that we include everybody, particularly when we're talking about the young people that we work with. Okay, so to start with then, just to sort of talk through what the issues are, I suppose there's been quite a lot of focus in recent years on high levels of homophobia in sport. You know, we've had a government inquiry. This slide is taken from some research that was carried out a few years ago in response to the Gay Rugby World Cup, and it was a survey, one of the largest surveys that have been done of gay and straight people. And as you can see from this slide, you know, experiences of homophobia were really, really high. So more than 3/4 of respondents had witnessed or experienced homophobia in sport. We know from other surveys that have included transgender people that when you talk to trans people in particular about their experiences, they are more likely to report high levels of homophobia and transphobia in sport as well. The Out on the Field survey, one of the things that is particularly interesting for us is that high levels of respondents were not open about their sexual orientation whilst playing youth sport. So they were either open to only a few people or not open at all. So and what's also really interesting about that, going slightly against the grain of common perception, actually more lesbians were partially or completely closeted during whilst playing youth sport compared to 70% of gay men. So therefore we know homophobia, biphobia and transphobia is a big issue. We also know that it creates one of the biggest barriers to people in sport. We've only got 45 minutes, so I'm not going to explain why that's actually the case. There are other opportunities to kind of read around the subject. So we know that sport has been experienced as not a particularly friendly place for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and other groups. I think looking specifically at the experiences of young people, one of the most pertinent pieces of research that's been carried out recently was the Youth Chances survey that was undertaken in 2016 that surveyed, I think around 7,000 young people in the UK aged between 16 and 25. And something like over 5,500 of those young people were were identified as LGBT plus. So it gives us a really good sense of where LGBT plus young people are up to, you know, at the moment. And I think some of the most important findings for sport about that from that survey are firstly that the average age of coming out in the UK has dropped dramatically in the last 15 years. So, so we know from some research by Stonewall that they estimate the average age of coming out at 15. Within the Youth Chances survey, over half the lesbian, gay, bisexual and questioning young people knew that they were LGBTQ by the age of 13, and even more of the trans respondents knew they were trans by the same age. Now, the reason that's an issue for us in sport is, I suppose, because when I started working in this field, we launched Sports 12 years ago, the average age of coming out was around about, I think, 18 to 21 probably. And actually, when we tried to talk about young people in sport, people didn't see it as an issue for youth sport at all. Now we have young people coming out at the age of 13, young people in a more accepting environment. Once they start realising and exploring their sexuality, tend to be more able to identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, questioning, you know, pansexual, a whole range of different kind of identities. And we know that young trans people are likely, because gender identity is not related to sexual orientation, we know that there's a higher number of trans children who are being seen at gender identity clinics and who are presenting also in a range of sports environments. So, so there are some challenges there for how we meet the needs of these children and young people. In the Youth Chances survey, over a third of the young people surveyed were not open about their sexuality or gender identity at a sports club they're involved in. Now, that's quite a different statistic from the statistic I gave you before, which was 70 to 73%. And I think there's a couple of explanations for that difference. One, this cohort was specifically young people, so 16 to 25-year-olds. The Out on the Field survey was, the data was collected through LGBT rugby clubs, football clubs and other sports groups, and we know that those groups tend to be populated by people in from in their late 20s. So one, there's going to be a bit of a generational change there. But also the Out on the Field survey asked people if they were open or partially open, which gives people the opportunity to say, well, you know, I told most people, but there were some people that I didn't tell. Then in terms of young people's experience, we've got, you know, 3/4 of young people experiencing name calling, nearly half have experienced harassment or threats and intimidation, and almost a quarter, so that's like 1 in 4 of LGBT plus young people have experienced physical assault. So if you're listening to this and you're in a room with other colleagues, just think about how many of you in that room, 1 in 4 of you would have experienced physical assault. And I think that's really, really quite astounding in a country like the UK, where we have some of the best protective legislation for LGBT plus people in the world. Of course, the results of bullying, isolation can result in mental health issues, and I think the last 3 points on this slide really address those issues and those current issues for young LGBT plus people. We know from other studies that are focused in on mental health in particular, that mental health is a really significant issue for LGBT plus people across the board. There's been some kind of research and speculation about what those issues are about, why that is the case, and it's thought that the correlation between mental health, sexual orientation and gender identity are these early experiences of bullying, experiences of isolation, and other forms of minority stress. So stress that affects minorities because of the discrimination that they face. We also know, and not from the Youth Chances Survey, but from some insight that we've recently gathered, that LGBT plus people across the board, so lesbians, gay men, bisexual, transgender people, pansexual, people who identify as queer, across the board, have had a negative experience of school sport, and that's still the case. You know, that's not something that just was the experience of people like me, that's still an experience of young people today, and that does two things. One, it alienates young people from sport. It also, I think, has had an impact on the types of sport that LGBT plus people eventually engage in. So we know that, for example, LGBT plus people are less likely to take part in organised team sports than the population as a whole. And we also know as well that LGBT plus people feel quite alienated from competitive sport. Now, this is conjecture on my part, but bearing in mind the negative experiences of school sport, which can be a focus for homophobic, biphobic and transphobic bullying, I imagine that some of those aversions to team sports and competitive sports result from early school experiences. Okay, so that's just kind of like setting the scene really, about what the issues are. Are there any questions at this point?
I think you might come to it, but someone's asked about how can we support coaches knowing how to make their sessions more welcome or accepting?
Yeah, well, yeah, well, that's something that I'm going to go on to now. So the next two sections are going to be about how we create an environment, firstly, and then how we actually support LGBT plus people to participate. Okay.
Right.
So, okay, so the next section then is about what you can do to make your sports environment more inclusive of LGBT plus people, and particularly young people. So the first thing, of course, because we know about the prevalence of homophobia, biphobia and transphobia, is to make sure that staff, coaches, facilitators challenge that language every time it's heard. And that's really, really important, particularly with young people, because when young people hear language like that, they may be really isolated. They may be in environments where their identities are developing, and hearing people use negative language about them and about people they know can be really, really frightening. So for me, as an adult, if I hear somebody say something homophobic, I don't necessarily feel terrified by it, and I'm able to challenge that myself. Young people are not able to challenge language in the same way, with the same efficacy as adults. So one of the best things we can do, one of the most simple things we can do, is to challenge language every time we hear it. Going back to the question about how coaches create an inclusive environment, one of the things that I would say is it's always best to be proactive in these situations than reactive. So if you are a coach working with a group of young people and you set out your rules or your code of conduct at the beginning of any session, or just the kind of, you know, the guidelines by which the session's going to be run, make sure that you get something in about language and about bullying language, and particularly I would say about homophobic language is well worth mentioning, because it's so prevalent in sport. Okay, the second thing is to make sure that everyone understands why homophobic, biphobic, transphobic language is offensive. You know, the world is changing, so people have a better understanding of the issues. But I still encounter coaches who will say things like, well, you know, it's just a bit of banter, or, you know, why is saying, oh, get up, you girl, why is that homophobic? And basically, as a rule, at Pride Sports, we say that any language that tries to that's sexist is also likely to affect LGBT plus people. Any language that tries to emasculate young men is likely to be offensive to young people. So as far as we're concerned, there's no such thing as homophobic banter. There's just homophobia, and that can be conscious or unconscious. You know, we know that young children, for example, we know that young boys who play football are using homophobic slurs from about the age of 9 or 10. So the way that we would challenge a 9 or 10-year-old about the language they use might be slightly different to the way we would challenge, say, for example, a 15-year-old. But homophobic language is homophobic language, whether a child intends it to be or not. One of the things that's quite often overlooked, we think, in terms of creating a positive environment is making sure that language is inclusive. So one of the things, I was speaking to a performance athlete a few years ago, and he said to me, you know, one of the things that would have made my life so much more simple on the performance pathway was if my coach had not assumed that I was heterosexual. So, for example, you know, if we were going to an awards night and the coach or the club said, you know, you can bring your girlfriends or boyfriends along to that event. Then if we use language that's inclusive, it stops people having to come out about who they are. If we don't make assumptions about young people's gender, then it stops them having to come out about who they are. I was delivering some training last week, and I was asked by somebody how that they'd been in a situation where they'd misgendered a young person. And I have to hold my hands up and say I misgendered a young person once when I was delivering a session quite a few years ago. And actually, the best way I know of dealing with that, again, is being proactive. So if you're working with a group of young people that you don't know, what we would do now is we'll just get a sticker in which the young person writes their name and then writes the pronouns by which they would want to be addressed, and that saves. And that means that the young person is then assured from the beginning of the session that their gender is going to be acknowledged in the way that they want it to be acknowledged. So challenge stereotypes and value the individual. There's still a huge amount of stereotypes that exist in and around sport, and I think, for example, women's sport, there's still a lot of stereotypes around women who play sport, who must be lesbians. We get reports of a lot of name calling of girls and young women who play sports, you know, traditional male sports. And about the stereotypes that still persist in that area. So make sure, you know, if you are working with a group of young people, that that those stereotypes that are challenged. We would also say, and I know this is quite difficult for some NGBs because they already have their, you know, they will have kind of standard policies and procedures that are handed out by the national governing body to regional associations and to clubs. but where you can, we think it's really important to include reference to homophobic, biphobic and transphobic language in anti-bullying policies and procedures. And that is because we know that those issues are really, really prevalent for young people, and therefore it's really, really important to name those things where you can, so that staff or community coaches or club secretaries or volunteers, when they go have a look at the policy and procedure, their attention is drawn to this issue specifically. So one of the other things is that we know is that that one of the effects of homophobia, biphobia and transphobia is that LGBT people and plus people can be made invisible and have been made invisible in sport. So it's any opportunity you get to highlight the achievements of people from any communities, from diverse communities, is can be really, really effective. I know, I think it might have been in February actually, that British Triathlon put together a bit of a campaign where they profiled some LGBT athletes from within their sport, and I think that was really well. I think that we experienced that as quite an effective campaign. It'd be interesting to find out, you know, how that actually worked out for them. So there are some good examples of people being made visible, so that young people coming through, when they're aspiring to participate in sport, they can see people ahead of them on the pathway. One of the things that's really important, we think, is to know where national governing bodies stand on the participation of trans people in competition, and actually stand on the participation of trans people in general. We were having a bit of a chat before the seminar kicked off about how the focus on regulation in sport, and in a way the medicalisation of trans people in sport, when actually the Equality Act says, in relation to, and identifies trans people as transsexual people, so people who have had people who've had surgery or thinking about surgery and in their lives, that actually the Equality Act says you need to welcome people into sport in their gender, and that's the bottom line. So know where NGBs stand on the participation of trans people, and how that particularly relates to competition. And we would say, make sure people, we're going to talk about this in a minute, but just make sure that people have that information in advance. Make sure that that information is prominent, so that when people are coming along to sessions, they know where they stand before they arrive. So consider the facilities and whether they're suitable for all participants. You know, again, there's some of the debates that we come across a lot are, you know, how can, and it's always about transgender women, how can transgender women use communal facilities? We think there's a lot of stereotypes there around transgender women, and a lot of scaremongering that's happening in the media at the moment around transgender women and accessing women's facilities. Basically, the Equality Act says that people should be allowed to use the facilities that relate to their gender. That's the bottom line. Of course, there are people, trans people, who may be at early stages of transition, who don't want to change in communal changing rooms and may want to be afforded some more privacy, in which case it's absolutely great to be able to offer transgender people, particularly transgender children, if they want it, changing place that isn't just in one big communal block, but only if that's something that they want. If you don't have somewhere that's suitable, a nice place for people to change and get ready for sport, then there's also some option to offer a communal changing room, but at a different time. So maybe before other children access the changing facility, or maybe after that. But if you are offering those options to a transgender child, then it's really, really important that those adaptations to meet their needs do not single them out as different from other children. And you know, as I said before, make sure you communicate your policy on trans participation and competition with all stakeholders, so that basically everybody knows well in advance what experience they are going to have. And we would say go beyond you know, your policy. Create a page on your website, or create whatever methods you use for communicating with participants. Make sure that there's some really robust information on there about what people can expect when they turn up at your club, at your facility, so that people can then make choices. I mean, an example is that Pride Sports a couple of years ago ran a we used to run a trans five-a-side football session. We couldn't offer the privacy of cubicled changing rooms for people. There were just gendered communal changing rooms at the facility, and it would have cost us too much money to hire them. So we just told the participants who were taking part in the event that what the changing facilities were, and then they made a decision whether they wanted to access those facilities or whether they wanted to turn up in kit and then basically go home and get changed when and take a shower when they got home. And it's not ideal, but it was great. You know, people knew what they were getting when they came along to the session. And then, because we can't take everybody with us on this journey in a positive way, and because there's still some work to do, then what we need to do is make sure that we record all incidents and actions, any sanctions that we take, and the outcomes of these. And that's really, really important. One, so we get a really good idea of the kind of incidents that are occurring, the level of incidents that are occurring. We also find out what works and what doesn't work. So, you know, if we have a 9-year-old using homophobic language, and we take the time to explain to them why that's not okay, and then they stop using that homophobic language, we don't get any repeat incidents, then that might be something that we want to communicate to other staff, other delivery partners about what's been successful in terms of changing behaviour and changing attitudes. Okay, so before I go on to the section which is about supporting LGBT plus people to participate, are there any questions?
Yep, you have definitely got people thinking now, Lou. So David just kind of said they've had a recent experience with a primary school head indicating that these discussions weren't appropriate for a primary age, and he's referred to the fact that you kind of mentioned that the coming out is younger. You've talked about the language that 7, 8, 9-year-olds use. How can we help kind of this attitude to kind of start addressing this earlier?
Okay, well, I would say that one of the things that we deliver, Pride Sports delivers a whole range of different things, insight, various other things. We also run a campaign called Football versus Homophobia, and as part of that campaign, we have a module that we deliver to Key Stage 2 children. And we also have some resources as part of that campaign that talk about gender stereotyping, that also talk about language, because it's absolutely ridiculous not to be talking around these issues with children in primary education. The way we talk about them needs to be focused on the needs of primary school children, but the idea that we can't talk about these issues is ridiculous. You know, if we've got kids using the F word on a football pitch, then that's something that we need to be able to discuss with them. I would say if you drop us an email, particularly about working with primary children, we have the education lead for the Football versus Homophobia campaign can liaise with you about maybe how you address some of those issues in more depth, and we'd be really happy to support anybody with having some of those discussions at primary level.
There's a few questions about national governing bodies and stuff that's happening in clubs, so I won't kind of go into detail. We'll have a chance to respond to these after the webinar. But generally, how are NGBs trying to resolve issues with competition and participation that you know about?
Are we talking specifically here about trans participants?
I think they are, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So what's happened? What's happened is that we're in a bit of a funny situation in the UK, because what happened was the Sports Council Equality Group came up with some recommendations about the trans people in competitive sport, and there was some take up by NGBs of those governing body, of those guidelines, and some national governing bodies, for example the FA, did a whole piece of work around reviewing their trans guidance. They consulted with trans organisations, they consulted with an organisation called Gendered Intelligence, and they now have guidelines in place. They have trans players throughout the UK who are going through the process of becoming licensed players. So we know that the FA has done some really good work in this area. What I think is kind of quite ironic is that the English FA has better transgender guidance than Uefa and Fifa. Uefa and, well, particularly FIFA are still working on a gender verification policy, which is, you know, from the ARC. So you've got somebody like the English FA who have taken a real lead in this area. Then what you've got is across a whole range of other sports, you've got a real mixed bag of how people responded to the Sports Council Equality Group guidance. Meanwhile, what has happened is some quite a bit of work has been done lobbying the IOC, and so in the meantime, the IOC has rewritten its own trans policy and trans guidance. So now what we have is the IOC has probably, you know, so basically in some sports, it's easier for you as a trans person to compete in the Olympics than to compete in a domestic competition in your sport in the UK. So really, I think, you know, if you look at the work that the FA has done, as an example, you know, it's not perfect. I don't think it's perfect. You know, we know of, for example, a trans footballer who wanted to play at a grassroots level, and it took her 3 years to be able to play. So the FA's policy is not perfect, but it's loads better than a lot of other people's, a lot of other NGBs. And I think, you know, as a good practice model, they did consultation with trans communities and provided some, you know, a bit of educational information as well as part of that process. So, so some good work there. Some of the other NGBs I'm aware of need to really get up to speed with the IOC's changes from, you know, 2 years ago now. They were for Rio. They were in place for Rio. So.
Thanks, Luke. So people have given some examples of their own policy. So what we're going to ask is, if they're happy to share, we can then add them to the kind of webinar link and the questions that we answer, so people have got a starting point if they're starting from scratch. Thanks,
Lovely.
Luke.
That's brilliant, and hopefully you'll share those with me as well, so that when when I'm addressing this issue, I can talk about NGBs doing good work. Okay.
Yeah, will do.
Yeah. Okay. So going on to the final section then, supporting LGBT plus people to participate. We always think that the best way forward is to actually ask LGBT plus people what they want. One of the I think one of the dangers we have in sport is because sport's very insular on a load of different levels. Quite often what happens is that people want to consult their membership or talk to people who are already part of their sport, and I think that's hugely important. It's absolutely, some LGBT plus people who are already part of sport have got some fantastic insight. I think that we also need to do some work with people outside of the sport as well. So looking at what people's perceptions of our sport are in particular, and how they could become more engaged. So the Ask LGBT plus people what they want is a two-part process. It's partly consulting within, but it's partly looking outwards as well, and gaining some real insight, both from inside and outside our sport. One of the other things that we would say is that one of the reasons that sport is a really, really tricky place for LGBT plus people is because it's a very gendered space, and can be a very gendered space. So even when you've got something like softball in the UK, there are gender roles for male and female gender roles within every mixed team. So I know that that's something that BS UK are discussing at the moment, and looking at some of those issues. So if you've got an opportunity, particularly with young people, to offer mixed sporting physical activity offers, then that tends to work for young people, either young people who don't identify with the gender binary, so non-binary young people. Sometimes that's a nicer space for young trans people to inhabit, and quite often as well for young gay men who have been in sporting environments that have been very, very masculinist, very macho environments. Sometimes an environment that has a whole range of gender and different gender expression can be a bit of a relief from those kind of traditional school sports environments. Really obviously, I suppose, we think it's really important to offer taster and have a go sessions for people. LGBT plus people, we know from recent insight, tend to be really alienated by competition, certainly in the first instance. So anything that can give them the opportunity to come and have a go. LGBT plus people tend to be more intimidated than the population as a whole from actual sports environments, formal sports environments. So anything that you can offer that's a bit out of the ordinary, a bit unusual in the community, that breaks down those barriers of intimidation, we would really recommend. As I've said before, we know that LGBT plus people, again, across the board, I want to provide you with lots of differentiation, but actually some of our recent insight shows that the experiences are quite similar across all groups. So we think it's really important to provide opportunities for people to socialise with others. One of the things that we know is that LGBT plus people can be really intimidated by team sports. And again, my conjecture around that is that those team environments can be really difficult to break into. and if you feel different, or if you feel potentially different from people, team environments can be really intimidating places. So what we have is LGBT plus communities and people knowing that that sport and physical activity is good for them, wanting to participate, but participating in solo activities because that's less intimidating. Then, of course, that becomes a vicious circle, because actually one of the things that we know is that team sports and team activities, group activities, can be so good for people's mental health. And we know that mental health is a key issue for this group. So what's happening at the moment is LGBT plus young people are potentially missing out on some of that really empowering group physical activity kind of work. So anything that we can do to provide opportunities, particularly for young people, to socialise with others can be like hugely powerful in dealing with things like issues like stigma, isolation, mental health, a whole range of different issues. We know because mental health is a big issue for LGBT plus people, we also know that people understand that there's a link between physical activity and mental health. I think that's been probably been pushed quite a lot in the last few years by Sport England, and then, you know, cascaded down through by Public Health England as well. So I think that that's a key hook, I think, for LGBT plus people, is aligning physical activity and the mental health benefits of physical activity. So I think you've got a real kind of opportunity there for saying to people, this isn't just about getting fit, this isn't just about looking good, or, you know, or staying thin or managing weight. This is also about, you know what, if you do 30 minutes exercise 3 times a week, you are going to manage your anxiety so much better than, you know, if you play Xbox or, you know, whatever. So again, stress the fun aspects of participation and downplay any competition because of the aversion to competition. As I was saying before, make sure that you share information about changing facilities in advance. So it's not always about having the right thing there, but letting people know what they're walking into. And as I said, you know, Pride Sports, when we deliver events, we can't always afford to get it right. You know, we use community facilities, but we let people know in advance what's there. We also think with young people, on the whole, LGBT plus people want to feel included, so want to feel part of a broader offer. And I think that's particularly true of lesbian, gay and bisexual people, who may feel slightly more enfranchised than people from other from more marginal aspects of the community. So young people, people who don't feel very confident in their identities, people who identify as queer, pansexual, asexual, those people who currently are kind of on the margins of LGBT, are more likely to want offers that specifically focus on their community. So I was, before the seminar started, webinar started, I was just talking about an event we have coming up in the summer, Pride Youth Games, which is an event where we pull together about between 100 and 120 LGBT young people from throughout the UK, and they spend a weekend together taking part in sport with other LGBT plus young people. And I know from our evaluation of previous events and talking to young people that they find that event incredibly empowering. One, it reduces isolation. They meet other young people like them, which is really empowering and exciting. Two, they get to do sport in an environment that's really welcoming with other people like them. And three, you know, and then three, they get to, you know, socialize, meet other people, try new things, without kind of any fear that you know, any fear of homophobia, biphobia, or transphobia. So also, you know, any opportunity that you have for stressing the casual nature of the offer, because as I said before, LGBT plus people can find formal sports environments, you know, gyms, really intimidating, or you know, sports centres, for example, places that are there for people to do sport can be really alienating for LGBT plus people. So a bit of creativity about where we offer sport, I think, can be really valuable. There are some really good examples in terms of young people, particularly. I know in Manchester of Greater Sport, the County Sports Partnership there offered some sessions in partnership with the Proud Trust, which is a local LGBT youth organisation. And certainly I know the young people reported really positively on that, because sport came to them, you know, and provided sport in a way that they found comfortable. So, you know, some really great examples there. For example, another example being, I know that Aston Villa Community Foundation offer a five-a-side session in partnership with the local trans community in Birmingham. Again, evaluation, some early evaluation of that I saw was kind of overwhelmingly positive. And I know that Aston Villa did some work around talking to people about where the session should be, where people would feel comfortable coming, you know, which environments would be intimidating. So, so any opportunity to talk to participants or potential participants about the kinds of venues, the kind of places that you can use, can have really big benefits. And that's kind of it really from me. I don't know what. Oh gosh, it's 5:02, so I've gone on a bit long. Just to say, if following up from this, if you've got any questions, if you drop us an email, you know, we will get back to you as soon as we can, and we'll try and answer your questions. And that's it for me.
Thanks. Just one question before you go, and I think it's really key. Someone's asked, in some sports there are LGBT plus sports clubs. From an NGB's point of view, is it good to consider setting up these clubs, or will this cause more isolation?
I think that's a really great question, and it's a bit of a debate that's gone on for a long time. I think what I think is this, actually. I think that LGBT plus sports clubs have generally been set up by people from the community themselves. So I think NGBs setting up clubs, if you know, themselves, is a bit of an odd one, because actually the imperative for those clubs comes from the communities. What I think, and where I think NGBs have a role, is saying, we welcome LGBT plus people in, you know, and this could include LGBT plus specific provision, and we will facilitate the development of LGBT plus provision in partnership with the community. And I think that that's the key thing. I think trying to set up something and expecting people to come, I think that's why if you set up taster events, then you will know if they've got legs. You know, you will know if they're going somewhere. You know, as Pride Sports, for example, we have offered people, we have provided pump priming funding for a whole range of groups. The most recent one is Willow Tree Karate Group in Newcastle, and it's an LGBT karate group. It's a really small cohort of people, but we funded them over a year ago now. They're still going because we underwrote some of their costs. We only gave them 500 quid, but you know, we underwrote some of their costs. They're still going. People are progressing, you know, they're on the pathway, they've all just done some badges, you know, so we know that if you facilitate people to self-organise, they will. But we, you know, I think, so NGVs need to offer taster sessions, offer opportunities to support local people to develop things themselves. And really, that's the model of sport everywhere, isn't it? You know, that's not just LGBT plus people.
Thanks ever so much, Lou.
Okay, so thank you, Lou, for facilitating that discussion. It was really insightful. I've avidly been taking notes, so that was really helpful and useful for me. I'm sure everybody else really appreciates that. We've got lots of thank yous on the screen. In terms of people's further learning and development, because we've obviously only had an hour this morning, we've put some links out to other resources that people can access. Some of them are a bit older, so the first one is from 2012, but it's 1,000 students, young people between the ages of 16 and 22, and that kind of was done using workshops, so that's quite useful. Lou talked about the out on the fields researcher. We've kind of put that in there as well. Swimming have provided some practical tech, a profile about what they're kind of doing within theirs. So there's a link to that one. The toolkit that was developed by Stonewall, make everyone's game the sports toolkit, which is great. And then there's the parliamentary report into homophobia. And then lastly, we put the link there to the report that Lou was involved in for sport, physical activity and LGBT. So that's the end of the webinar, exactly 12 o'clock.
We have kind of run out of time. I do understand quite a lot of you have got questions. So I would suggest you link back to previous webinars we've run on this topic, including one that we did with gendered intelligence that Lou referred to. We'll put links to those in an email. But as I've said, the questions we will have a look at and respond to and get these back to you. I just want to take this time to say thank you so much for Lou. Thanks for all of you that have joined us this morning. I hope it was useful, and see you all soon. Thanks very much. Thank you.